Shockingly, slavery was worse than we all thought. Slave breeding was a controversial practice during the age of American slavery because it involved the forced procreation of slaves. While our grasp of this topic has developed over time, the 10 shocking facts presented in this video provide new insight on the practice of slave breeding in the United States. I think it's important that you understand what I mean by slave breeding before we dig into the history of the disturbing practice of slave breeding in the United States. Slave owners' goal was to increase their slave population, and one way they did this was by having their slaves engage in sexual acts with each other and with free men, and this further proves that slavery was way worse than we all thought. This sexual arrangement served only to generate more slaves to serve as livestock. After the banning of commerce in slaves in the early 19th century, the practice became widespread in the South, particularly on farms and slave breeding farms. These are facts about slave breeding that, sadly, have not been taught in schools. This documentary will focus solely on these topics. Let's dive in. From the 1830s to the 1860s, free black people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, and white supporters like William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the radical newspaper The Liberator, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of the best-selling anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, helped lead the charge to end slavery in the United States. The number of slaves available in the United States shrank after 1808, when the importation of slaves was outlawed. In order to assure a constant supply of slave labor, plantation owners instituted a breeding program. What you're about to read may be upsetting, but it accurately describes the brutal conditions under which slaves lived. Let's start with the first known fact. One way that slaveholders tried to increase their supply of slaves to work their plantations was through a practice known as slave breeding. Slaves were compelled to procreate in order to provide a steady supply of cheap labor. Slave owners saw their slaves as a valuable resource, so they actively encouraged, or at least did not try to prevent them from reproducing. Their children would be considered property and help further the economic interests of their slaveholders, especially in the South. This was a common practice. Slaves, especially ladies, were highly sought for. Their owners used their animals' reproductive powers to further their own financial objectives. Historical accounts, including testimonies from those who were once enslaved, help us piece together these women's experiences. While most of the evidence has been lost or destroyed, we may still piece together the full picture through larger stories and individual accounts. The story of Frederick Douglass, an eminent abolitionist and former slave, sheds light on this harrowing reality. He goes into detail on how enslaved women were treated and how they were exploited as little more than reproductive machines. There he used the longest whipping. Douglass's account, and others like it, shed light on the cruel treatment of enslaved women who were forced to reproduce. Several men were forced to have children for their owner's economic advantage, and many were removed from their companions and pushed into undesired sexual encounters. Additional proof of this dehumanizing approach can be found in historical records. The ability to reproduce, for example, was often highlighted in plantation records and adverts for the sale of slaves. These records show how slavery viewed women as property to be exploited for their reproductive capabilities only. Harriet Jacobs, a former slave who wrote an autobiography titled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, also provides powerful testimony. Jacobs tells a compelling story about how she was sexually exploited and forced to have children. Large-scale plantation agriculture supported a more robust slave-breeding economy in the southern states of the United States. Cotton, tobacco, and rice were grown on these estates, and they required an endless supply of laborers. Large-scale plantations in the South necessitated the use of a large number of slaves to tend the land. Slave breeding became extremely common in this area because of this desire. Slave labor from Africa provided the foundation for the southern plantation economy. They worked from sunrise till night in the awful heat and humidity. Slaveholders resorted to slave reproduction to ensure a steady supply of cheap labor. The scale of the slave breeding industry in the South can be gauged from archival archives and papers. Slaves' ability to reproduce was often cited as a major selling advantage in descriptions of slave auctions and ads for the sale of enslaved people. For instance, the following advertising appeared in 18th century Southern newspapers. a 25-year-old mother of 4 who is a natural at reproducing. Slaves on plantations were often paired up by their masters based on their perceived physical or occupational suitability. Slave families suffered greatly as a result of this unrelenting quest of profit. Slave owners' pursuit of profit in the breeding industry often necessitated the separation of married couples and their offspring. A system of human bondage and dehumanization was maintained through the well-established slave breeding industry in the southern states. This inhumane practice was motivated by the economic necessity of increasing output per slave. Another fact is, slave owners viewed their slaves as an asset and sought to increase the value of their holdings by methods such as forced reproduction. This materialistic outlook diminished human beings to nothing more than objects. Slave owners viewed their slaves as valuable assets, on par with other types of property and even as animals in some cases. Their primary focus was on increasing their wealth and workforce, even if doing so meant disregarding the health and happiness of the slaves under their care. Historical records such as diaries and first-person narratives provide light on the hearts and minds of slaveholders by detailing the brutal treatment of slaves. Because of their ability to bear children, enslaved women were singled out for forced reproduction. They were not only coerced into relationships against their will, but also exposed to severe sexual assault at the hands of their owners. The connection between former U.S. President Thomas Jefferson and his slave Sally Hemings is one example of such extreme sexual abuse. Many people believe that Jefferson fathered children with Hemings, but he denied paternity. The story of Celia, a Missouri slave, and her master Robert Newsom is another heartbreaking example. Celia was sexually assaulted by Newsom on multiple occasions before she killed him in self-defense. Celia, despite her defense, was treated as property and sentenced to death. It was a disputed contention at the time that Celia had accidentally killed Robert Newsom in self-defense to prevent Newsom from raping her. After her appeal was turned down in December 1851, she was executed by hanging. Former slave women have spoken out about the horrific sexual abuse they suffered. Slave owners' emphasis on profit through forced reproduction underscored their reduction of slaves to mere investments. Slaves' reproductive ability were a major factor in the market for their sale and purchase. Slave males could also be exploited for sexual motives. They were picked mostly because of how healthy and fit they looked. In spite of the fact that enslaved women are frequently the subject of discussions on the breeding of slaves, it is essential to recognize that enslaved men also face the risk of being exploited for the goal of breeding slaves. Within the framework of the institution of slavery, they too were made to endure the exploitation of their bodies and were viewed as mere commodities. In order to ascertain whether or not enslaved males were suitable for breeding, their physical characteristics and state of health were frequently evaluated. They were objectified and appraised simply for their potential to bear children, just like women who were held in slavery. On plantations, the owners of the slaves would choose particular individuals to work for them based on their desirable characteristics, such as their strength, endurance, and physical height. The objective was to produce offspring who would contribute to the labor force and improve the riches of the slaveholder. These males were then partnered with enslaved women who were suited for breeding with the hope of creating offspring. They were frequently described to as studs or breeding stock, which dehumanized them in the minds of others. The enslaved men who were able to get the most women pregnant were frequently rewarded by their plantation masters. It is commonly held that slave masters reward those who are able to get the most slave women pregnant with their offspring. Although it may sound absurd, this was indeed the case with these guys. The dehumanizing and exploitative nature of the system of slavery extended to a distressing practice in which some plantation owners offered incentives and rewards to enslaved men who were able to father the most children by their female slaves. Within the community of those who were slaves, they grew to be regarded with admiration and envy. However, the so-called reward system only served to further dehumanize and objectify the people who were enslaved, reducing them to the status of mindless breeding machines. This practice was allowed to continue because of the reward system. Thomas Nicholson, a man who was owned by John Randolph of Virginia, was another guy who is said to have been rewarded for his capacity to father children with several enslaved women on the Randolph plantation. It was rumored that John Randolph of Virginia had awarded Nicholson for his ability to father children with multiple enslaved women. His status is somewhat higher than that of other people who are enslaved due to the fact that he is used as a breeding stud. He gets some privileges as a result of this.